I was 2 breaths away from saying yes when my uncle stood up and told a room full of relatives a truth none of us were ready to hear. The engagement party had been everything I imagined: string lights and white tablecloths, a band that played my partner's favorite old songs, the clinking of glasses, cousins I hadn't seen in years leaning in to congratulate us. I had rehearsed my thank you speech 100 times, the lines bright and safe in my head: gratitude, promises, the little jokes that make the whole thing ours. The ring on my hand felt warm. The night smelled like lemon-scented candles and polished wood. Then my uncle cleared his throat. He is a man who owns the room whenever he wants. He has always been that steady presence, soft-spoken at family dinners, the sort who reminds you to call your mother. He is the kind of person you think of when you imagine pillar of the family. He held up a thin envelope. He did not fumble with it. He did not smile. "I promised you all I would not let this be buried again," he said, and the words landed like ice in the punch bowl. His revelation wasn't a petty secret. There was no way he would have stood up for gossip. He said, carefully, that the fortune our family celebrated had been protected, generation after generation, by deals and omissions no one in that room had known the true cost of. He said that for 3 generations, the family had hidden payments and quieted voices: workers, tenants, neighbors, people whose memories had been bought and locked away in little trusts and shell companies. He named no names at first. He let the silence take the room. Then he handed the envelope to my sister and asked me to read what was inside. It was a ledger, not the old-fashioned kind, but a modern bank printout, transfers labeled with cryptic company names, small monthly amounts that accumulated into a pattern. The ledger reached back decades. Beside it were a few yellowed letters, copies of bribes, hush agreements, a note about a worker who had been paid to sign a non-disclosure and then moved to another state. The paper smelled like dust and denial. No one laughed. My partner's smile collapsed. My mother's hand squeezed mine until I felt the bones. There was a low shuffling of feet. Someone tried to clear their throat and failed. "I couldn't keep pretending," my uncle said, "not when a child is living the consequences of this silence." That line, about a child, pulled the room open. It did not just implicate nameless wrongs. It pointed to a pattern, a lineage of protection that had allowed powerful men to slip away when their deeds came to light. It was not a single sin. It was an institutional choice, to shield wealth at the cost of lives. There was a hum of cell phones, a dozen cameras dying to be first to publish. Somebody whispered the basics into a group chat. Someone else filmed my uncle's hands, as if his gesture might be proof. Guests parted like curtains. For a few dizzy minutes, the party continued around the edges, the band, the horse hors d'oeuvres, but the center had become a charged wire. I still remember my partner's face: confusion, then a flicker of fear. "Who?" they mouthed. But my uncle did not want to point fingers at our family alone. He wanted context. "The ledger is one thing," he said, voice steady, "but there is a pattern, and patterns repeat. I have seen it twice. I will not let it happen a 3rd time." The camera lights focused in uncertain beams. A cousin demanded an explanation. My uncle looked at me. "You deserve to know," he said. "All of you do." At that moment, I felt as if the floor had shifted under my feet. The neat scaffolding of my life, the job, the upcoming vows, the sense that our family was, if not flawless, at least decent, suddenly sat on a fault line. "Stay with me. I'm going to tell you everything I think I know, and it will make less and less sense if you walk away now." The ledger did not point to a single crime you could call to the police. It showed a method: suppression by payment, relocation, and the occasional legal wrapper that skirted responsibility. The more we dug into the papers my uncle had brought, the clearer it became that the same blueprint, the blueprint of hiding, had been deployed somewhere else in the city not long before. A powerful man named Gabriel Montero, a philanthropist whose face was on billboards and whose name was on the hospital wing downtown, had been arrested under charges that read like a legal script: embezzlement, fraudulent transfers, a tangle of shell companies. The arrest had shocked the city. Tonight, with the ledger on our table, my uncle said the pattern was too similar to be coincidence. Gabriel Montero was not part of our family, but his story, his fall, was a mirror.
The methods that had preserved my family's fortune for 3 generations seemed to be the methods used to wipe another man's reputation clean. And hidden at the center of his story was a child, an infant named Mateo, who became, in the glare of police lights and camera flashes, the fragile human figure that a system tried to make invisible. I knew Gabriel by sight. He had been on the cover of the paper for his charity gala, always gracious and a boutonniere, easily photographed with a child on his lap. I had admired his public gestures, scholarships, clinics, donations. He had given to our own hospital once, quietly. My recollection was surface level, like someone who pays attention to headlines but not to the ink smudges beneath them. My uncle's ledger made me look again. The story I had learned that night at my own engagement was not the beginning. It was the echo of something already happening. A week before the ledger surfaced, Gabriel had been arrested on a weekday afternoon outside his marble office tower.
The arrest had been humiliating and public, the kind of thing photographers live for. Officers in tactical vests, a man in a pressed suit cuffed while the morning crowd looked up from coffees and phone screens. He had been led away with a worried infant and a defense team scrambling to buy time. Gabriel's wife, Clara, had stood on the marble steps with a composed face. People called her a steel magnolia in the press, inscrutable, efficient, and the kind of person you bet had never once lost her temper in public. But the coverage missed a crucial detail. Not everything about that brand of composure is truth. Sometimes it is a costume stitched with ledger lines. The first memory that came to me from the months that followed the arrest was not in the courtroom. It was in a small, overheated hospital room with fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. A tiny, sweating infant lay against a woman's chest. She was not a nurse. She was a domestic worker named Lucia Ramos. Lucia was the kind of person the world misnames invisible. She carried her history in the tilt of her shoulders and the steady way she calibrated risk. She had worked in the Montero household on and off for years, cleaning, babysitting, running errands, unremarkable work to most observers. But she had seen things others had not: late-night conversations that never reached the news, quick transfers on a ledger, the way a file could be misplaced. When Gabriel was taken that day, the house went into a kind of freefall. Family members arranged statements, PR teams wrote neutrality scripts, lawyers instructed everyone to say as little as possible. Clara, who had the posture of someone who could sign away a life without blinking, maintained a tight public line: deny wrongdoing, defer to counsel, nothing else. While all of that was happening, Mateo, 2 months old, feverish and confused, ended up in Lucia's arms because she had been in the house at the time, feeding him, calming him, doing the small things adults forget are the whole of care. The police had not planned around an infant. Protocol does not help a baby. They had filed paperwork. Officers had pushed for a temporary placement. Media vans circled. It is easy to forget in the rush of news cycles what happens when the cameras point away. A child with a temperature and no one willing to claim him because the adults in his life were busy saving reputations. Lucia took Mateo to the emergency room. She had no legal right to do what she did. She had no formal gatekeeping authority. What she had was presence, a determination that no child should be made invisible because the adults around him were playing political chess. In the fluorescent hospital, she waited for doctors while she whispered to the baby, kept his temperature down with damp cloths, and refused the nervous offers of hospital social workers to place him temporarily with foster services. It was in that room that Gabriel, sitting on a visitor's chair with wrists still inflamed from where an officer had threatened them with handcuffs, wrote. He found a pen, though he could barely steady his hand, and drafted a short note on whatever paper he could find. It was not a covenant. It was a pragmatism. Lucia, he scrolled, voice hoarse. In the event I am detained, I authorize you to make decisions on Mateo's behalf. You are to be his guardian until I return. He signed it with the neat flourish of someone who had written wills and grant authorizations in more comfortable circumstances. The hospital staff framed it differently in their reports. The paper sat in the medical file like a signal lighthouse. In the weeks that followed, lawyers would argue over the legal weight of his scribble. Clara's team would insist it was an overreach, that a handwritten note could not replace formal guardianship. But the note mattered in a fundamental human way. It had Gabriel's name, and it had his trust. Lucia had his authorization, imperfect and contested as it would become. That authorization became a hinge. When the formalities of the arrest made it impossible for Gabriel to be present for Mateo's immediate care, Lucia used the note to enroll the baby in daycare, to sign consent forms for well child visits, to argue with school administrators who asked the wrong questions. The note did not make her untouchable, it made her a target. When a powerful family feels its control loosening, it acts. Within days of the arrest, the smear machine engaged. Anonymous videos surfaced online, edited clips taken from private moments, slanted to imply impropriety. Opinion pieces ran that assumed guilt in their leads. Press releases appeared from concerned partners embedded in the city's financial ecosystem, warning of systemic rot and painting Gabriel's charitable work as a facade. The message was clear. This was a cautionary tale about a man who had let his hubris take him too far. The smear campaign had a kernel of procedural plausibility, but it was ugly in the way it weaponized basic human empathy. Show a baby in sorrow, add a few insinuations about misuse of funds, and watch the public instinct to moralize take hold. Meanwhile, those who knew the ledger lines, the way hush payments had made uncomfortable things silent, saw the pattern and felt the hairs rise on their necks. The ledger on my sister's lap was now a mirror. A history of concealment allowed for new concealments to be built. A private investigator named Derek Hayes came into the story like a sudden, efficient gust of wind. Derek was a former federal financial crimes investigator who smelled money like a truffle dog smells fungus. He had a reputation for following paper trails until they bled light. When Gabriel's attorney, Daniel Morera, reached out to him, he did not do it for the glamour. He did it because the pattern looked like the work of someone who understood both money and silence.
Derek found oddities a scanner would not flag. He found shell accounts that moved money through 3 countries before returning it home in disguised wedges, the financial equivalent of a scar placed so deep you hardly noticed the twitch had caused in the surface. He found an internal memo from a consulting firm that suggested reputation mitigation should include strategic relocation for certain persons, language that sounded clinical until you realized what it meant for a human life. Derek knew, and he told Maya Cardoso. Maya was an investigative journalist who did not drink the city's champagne. She drank coffee, stayed late, and loved documents like a hunter loves trails. She had a podcast with substantial reach, a platform built on slow, meticulous exposés. When Derek walked into her office with a folder, she listened. He did not want to go public without proof. She did not publish without being certain. They worked the evidence the way you work a seam in rock, patient, methodical, careful not to collapse the entire structure for lack of one essential stone. They found a pattern connecting payments to a company that had phony addresses and employees who never seemed to work anywhere physical. They found, in a safety deposit box accessed briefly by a mid-level accountant, a set of DVDs with recordings of meetings where strategy was discussed like a chess match. In those recordings, a woman with Clara's cadence, her precision, spoke about removing liabilities and reallocating assets. A man with Rick Faria's easy charm spoke about building plausible deniability. Their voices were bloodless, their laughter fragile and metallic. Rick Faria was less known to the public than Clara or Gabriel. He was the kind of fixer who moved in the spaces between corporate emails and whispered phone calls. Rumors said he specialized in solving problems for the powerful, getting rid of lawsuits, arranging quiet exits, and, when necessary, making people disappear from the storyline. Rick's name rarely surfaced in press releases, unless it was to deny involvement. When Derek surfaced a document tying a consultant fee to one of Rick's shell companies, and then showed an internal memo where the same shell company was referenced in a plan to isolate key witnesses, things stopped being rumor and became evidence. I could have remained at my party. I could have closed the envelope, smiled, and let the family work it out in private. My uncle's ledger had already shifted the geometry of loyalty. The ledger said, without preaching, that silence had a price, and that price had been exacted often and quietly. Watching Clara on the marble steps at Gabriel's arrest, watching her collect herself like a statue, I felt something estranged in my chest. I remembered the way my great-grandfather once told me, half joking, that we keep the house tidy, people are messy. The ledger made me see that tidy houses have basements where mess is locked away.
In the weeks after the engagement, I began to trace the connections myself. I met Derek in a coffee shop that smelled of oil and sugar, and he laid out the evidence. He was blunt. We have to prove a chain: money, contracts, people who acted to silence. If we can show the pattern, we can stop them from doing this to anyone else. Maya called me next. She had already published a short primer about the Montero arrest, carefully sourced and cautious. She said she couldn't go further without corroboration. If your family ledger and what we found overlap, that means this isn't about one isolated event, she said. It means it's a system. I began to ask questions at family meals that made relatives look at me like I had lost the plot. I asked when the payments began, who signed the checks, why some employees had been moved away in their 20s for new positions. Each answer had a soft, rehearsed shape. The more I pushed, the clearer it became that many of the family stories I grew up with had been edited. There were gaps my uncle had decided to fill, but even his courage could not explain everything. Meanwhile, Gabriel's case moved through the gears of public spectacle and legal maneuver. Prosecutors in this city love neat narratives. If they can point to a pattern of transfers and construct an intent, they can build a crime that looks tidy to a jury. Defense lawyers like Daniel Morera pushed back. He collected affidavits and secured an expert to dispute the forensic accounting. Gabriel, meanwhile, had the newspapers feeding into a portrait that looked like both a villain and a victim. The public loves contradictions. Lucia, though, remained the most human piece of the puzzle. While lawyers debated, she did the daily, unglamorous things. She kept Mateo clean and didn't speak in the accusatory language of the press. She said in private that she had taken the baby because no one else in the house was willing to take him in the hours when he had a fever. She told Daniel that she had a piece of paper, Gabriel's note, and that it meant everything to her. Daniel looked worried when he heard this. He knew that a handwritten authorization is not the same as a court-ordered guardianship. He told Lucia to be careful, that law cared more for proof than for love. In one of the most painful moments I remember, Lucia sat across from me in a diner, the light from the window cutting bands across her hands like a prison. She told me about where she had come from. Small towns, seasonal jobs, friends who had been moved away because their presence was inconvenient, the way people are told to be grateful, and then punished if they are loud about injustice. She did not ask for pity, she asked for recognition. Everything I did for Mateo, she said, stirring a cup of coffee she wasn't really looking at, was because a child shouldn't be the collateral for someone else's reputation. Her voice held a kind of fierce courtesy.
She had learned to navigate systems by kindness and by stubbornness. When the world tried to make her invisible, the way my uncle's ledger suggested had been done to others, she would not go quietly. She did not think of herself as heroic. She thought of herself as necessary. Derek and Maya built the case like people who know how precarious evidence can be. They made copies of everything: bank statements, ledgers, receipts, audio files, and stored them on hard drives, encrypted with multiple passwords. There were backups in the cloud, backups on physical drives, versions sent to secure Dropboxes. Maya understood how stories disappear. You publish the first thing, and if it is wrong, or if the evidence is burned, your correction will arrive after the damage has been done. She said plainly that if we were to force a reckoning, we had to be better than the people who wrote lies for a living. And there were lies, crafted like perfumes, meant to disguise truth. Anonymous accounts began to circulate edited footage of Gabriel in private meetings. A blog with no listed authors posted a series of insights that painted the whole Montero Foundation as a corrupt family enterprise, and the thread drew comments that started to smell like a mob forming. The smear campaign hit the city's social arteries the way a stone hits a pond. Ripples, echoes, then a splash that no single person could control. One night, after a long day that had included a family fight and meeting with Derek, I returned to my apartment to find a voicemail that made my stomach slide. The message was rushed and breathless, a clerk at a storage facility calling to tell me that a safety deposit box associated with one of the shell companies had been accessed, and someone had left behind a charred paper. The word charred was like a cold key turning in a lock. Evidence that burned cannot be used. Evidence that smolders in the dark invites suspicion about the hands that caused it. The pattern of concealment was not just historical ledger entries and hush agreements. It extended into active, aggressive attempts to erase what might bring daylight. The safety deposit box and the storage unit were not random burns. They were desperate attempts to rewrite what documentary proof existed. And then the first attempt at physical eradication happened. Someone set fire to a rented house where Derek had been keeping copies of documents. It began late at night, a neighbor's dog barking, the smell of wet smoke pulling people to windows. Derek and Maya had been careful. They had backups, copies, duplicates, but fire is a particular kind of violence. It eats what it can reach, and leaves the rest charred and unreliable. The firemen called it suspicious. The police opened an arson investigation.
Because the house had been a safe house for evidence, the fire served a purpose beyond destruction. It was intimidation. When we learned of the blaze, I felt my chest tighten in a new way.
It was one thing to read a ledger at a party and think, abstractly, about systemic rot. It was another to see someone risk their life to keep a child's documents alive, and then to watch someone try to erase that life's history with flame. At the same time, the pressure in my family mounted. My uncle's ledger had not just revealed an abstract pattern, it had forced my relatives to reckon with culpability. Some offered apologies in quick, private text messages that read like damage control. Others argued at dinner tables that the cost of exposing the truth would be too high: reputations, marriages, livelihoods. I began to feel like an intruder in my own life, as if my attempt to love someone and promise a future had become unmoored because the family had been built on choices that some of us were not ready to name. Clara appeared in the story less as a caricature than as someone who recognized the architecture of protection and used it without moral hand-wringing. She was elegant in press statements. She was fierce in closed-door meetings. Rick Faria, running like an undertow behind the scenes, had the ability to make things go away, and he appeared to have orchestrated in a dozen small moves the smear and the financial redirection. I could not write his face from memory easily. He was not a regular at family dinners, but his fingerprints were everywhere. Shell companies, one-off consultants, and hired reputational specialists. When I pictured him, I saw someone who saw people as components on a ledger. There were moments of bright, honest courage among the muddle. Daniel Moreira, Gabriel's lawyer, fought with exhaustion and tenacity. He filed motions to preserve evidence and to challenge the validity of some of the prosecutorial theory. He called for independent forensic accounting. He pushed the court to consider whether the charges against Gabriel were based on flawed assumptions built on manipulated records. The legal word for the relief they sought was vacatur, to vacate charges when a proceeding is tainted or the evidence is inadequate. It was not a promise of exoneration. It was a procedural step, an admission that a system could be imperfect, and that sometimes the law must admit its mistake to function. Maya did what journalists do best. She asked the right people the right questions and did not settle for evasions. She published slow, careful episodes that laid out the money trail, the shell accounts, the voices in the recordings. She named sources when she could. She redacted when she must. Her podcast episodes functioned as both narration and evidence. They were backed up on multiple servers. They were downloaded and mirrored. She knows how easily a story can be strangled if it exists in only one place. It was in that climate, pressures at home, arson, smears, and the small, stubborn acts of caretakers like Lucia, that I realized I had a choice to make. My family wanted me to stay silent.
They promised convenience, calm, and protection. My uncle had already broken his silence at the party. His ledger had upset the equilibrium. The question was, would I close the ledger again, tuck it away with the other misdeeds, and proceed? Or would I let its pages be evidence, even if that meant ruptures I could not predict? I went back to the hospital room one evening, the place where the tiny breath of a child had once held people together. Matteo had grown a little. He recognized Lucia's voice and settled like an anchor when she held him. He was a child fragile by circumstance, not by nature. In the corner of the room was a small laminated copy of Gabriel's scribbled authorization. Someone had taped it to a clipboard, as if display could turn it into permanence. Lucia looked up when she saw me. There was fatigue in her eyes and a resolute peace. "We are not doing this for headlines," she said. "We are doing it for him." Her sentence cut through any lingering romanticism I had about family. This was not about loyalty to a name. It was about the cost of silence and the small courage to prevent a child from being collateral damage. I began to gather documents myself. I visited the municipal archive to look at old property transfers referenced in my uncle's ledger. I found that some parcels had been bought by companies with names that meant nothing, and then sold quickly when dents appeared in public perception, a pattern almost too neat. I pulled noise, date, and signature. I made copies and sent them, encrypted, to Maya and Derek. They responded with gratitude and a wariness that made me respect the fragility of evidence. There were harder moments. My mother cried and said I was trying to break the family. My cousin warned that social media would devour us. At one dinner, someone suggested that our confession could hand the advantage to people who wanted to tear our world down. "There are bad actors who will use any crack," a relative warned. It felt like watching someone argue for the preservation of a city by ignoring a spreading fire. And then, in the middle of that pressure, something small and human happened. Gabriel, detained and bruised by a prosecutor's theory that tried to make his philanthropy an accounting error, wrote another note. This one was longer, a letter that read less like legal text and more like a parent's plea. He described the hospital wing where Mateo had received immunizations, the volunteer days he had spent teaching kids about books, the scholarships he had arranged for students who otherwise would not have known a college campus. He did not deny the complexity of finances. He did not attempt to explain everything. He asked that people look not only at ledgers, but at lives. A month after my uncle's reveal, a short, blurry video appeared on an obscure news outlet showing a man in an expensive suit whispering to another in a dim parking garage.
The audio was muffled, but the phrase, "make sure the kid is taken care of until this blows over," was clear. The outlet labeled it a new tip. People debated the authenticity. A senator weighed in. The smear increased. And yet, beneath the chaos, there was a victory that tasted like gravel. The patterns we had started to trace now matched across different cases. The ledger in my family's dining room, the shell companies, the parking garage whisper. If you followed them close enough, they converged into a map that had a name on it. Rick Faria's name gleamed under the magnifying glass. By the time the embers of the safe house were still hot, the public had started to pay attention. Maya's podcast episodes were climbing charts. People began to ask hard questions about how power protects itself. The media cycle, which often flits to the next bright thing, had a stubborn story that refused to die. I had a choice to make that night at the hospital, in the smell of antiseptic and lemon, watching Lucia feed Mateo a bottle while he slept like a small, exhausted thing. I could protect my family by closing the ledger and say I had done the noble thing by preserving our peace, or I could stand with the woman who refused to let a child be the casualty of economies of silence. I chose the ledger, not as a vengeful weapon, but as a mirror. I began to bring documents to Daniel Moreira and to urge him to file motions that would preserve evidence rather than let it be dismissed. I took calls with Maya and offered my family's ledger as context for the pattern they were documenting. I understood that nothing I did would erase the past, but I believed that not acting would make me complicit. That decision made some people in my family angry. It made others quietly supportive. It made my uncle proud in the way some people are proud of someone when they finally make the choice to live up to the ideals they spoke about in private prayer. The weeks blurred into a rhythm of legal filings, encrypted file transfers, and late-night strategy calls. There were interviews with reporters who wanted sound bites and Instagram accounts that demanded immediate outrage. There were quieter, more surgical things: subpoenas served, motion hearings scheduled, forensic accountants calculating whether transfers constituted criminal intent. Vacating a charge, if it came, would not be the same as innocence. It would be a legal acknowledgement that the prosecution's case could not stand on the evidence as presented. Extraditions for those involved would be complicated, diplomatic, and slow. And then late in the night, after one particularly bruising day of family arguments, a photograph arrived on my phone from Derek. It was a picture of a metal box, its lid pried open, a cassette in a plastic sleeve. There was smoke across the edge of the image. Derek's caption read simply, "Found in a storage unit tied to Faria Holdings. Looks like someone tried to burn it, but it's salvageable."
It was the kind of moment that cinematically tightened everything. Here was physical proof that the erasures were intentional. Someone had tried to burn the record. And it suggested that the people who wanted to keep the ledger closed were willing to scorch the evidence that might open it. The fire at the safe house proceeded months later. For now, Derek's photo and the smoke-stained cassette were a warning. Someone was willing to risk arson to stop the truth. Someone had the means to make such a choice. Someone, possibly like Rick Faria, had made the necessary calculations that allowed them to rationalize intimidation. I fell asleep that night with the ledger's paper edges under my pillow, as if the physical weight of the documents could remind me to be brave. The next morning brought a new notification, a comment thread on the public forum debating whether I had done the right thing. People said I was naive. People said I was courageous. My mother texted that if anything happened to me, she hoped I had known that I was loved. This is the point in the story where choices become commitments. Once you decide to shine light in a place where others preferred the dim, you cannot unsee what you found there. You also cannot control the consequences. For me, the ledger was not just a collection of numbers. It was a mirror that reflected back the cost of being silent. It was a question: would I choose comfort, or would I risk exposure to protect the vulnerable? I want to be clear.
Our fight was never about spectacle. It was not a crusade for a scandal. It was an attempt, admittedly clumsy, human, and slow, to set a child somewhere safe, and to make sure the machinery of concealment could not be used to take him again. It was about ensuring that when the ledger's pages were read, the people whose voices had been bought would be heard. The room where I made that decision, my small kitchen, the light through the blinds, was quiet except for the soft breathing of the world outside. I picked up the phone and called Maya. "I'm ready," I said. "Do it." She asked me 3 simple questions about sources and cross-checks. Her voice, meticulous as always, wanted to be certain we wouldn't hand a pile of half-evidence to the court of public opinion. I gave her names, dates, the ledger, the image Derek had sent. She thanked me and told me she'd put everything in a safe account and begin the slow process of verifying. Maya's first episode dropped 2 weeks after I handed her the ledger and Derek's photo. She did something I did not expect. She opened the podcast with my voice. Not my face, my voice, clipped from a short interview I had given in a parked car the night I decided to stop protecting the family. I can still hear it in my head. Slow, deliberate, because she wanted listeners to feel that this was not some anonymous hit piece, but a person making a costly choice. The episode threaded the ledger to Gabriel's arrest.
It played the recording Derek had found, smoky, muffled, a parking garage's echo. And then carefully, it played the cassette Derek had salvaged from the storage unit. The cassette's sound was brittle, but in it were meetings, men talking like accountants, talking about people, a voice that sounded like Rick Faree's, flippant, naming liabilities and relocation, a woman's voice precise and measured, Clara's cadence as Derek and Daniel swore under oath, that spoke about securing the perimeter and ensuring silence. The episode arranged those clips next to bank printouts, mapped shell companies, and explained in plain terms what a consulting fee can disguise when deposited in accounts that are not tied to a person, but to a system. Maya released everything in a way that was legally cautious. She published documents to secure servers and used a secure Dropbox for the most sensitive files. She mirrored the files across multiple hosts. She explained to listeners, in an aside she always made about journalism, that evidence can be destroyed, but copies cannot be. Her team had encrypted archives in 3 countries. They had lawyers queued to respond to subpoenas. She was not cavalier. She was prepared. The day the episode went live, the city woke up to a public argument it could not ignore. The morning shows looped the highlights, while pundits argued over whether this was political theater or a legitimate scandal. My inbox filled with messages, ranging from vindication to threats. Someone had posted my uncle's ledger to a forum and captioned it with a taunt. A former family friend called to say we were ruining everything. My mother texted, "Please be careful." My father, silent for days, called twice and left terse voicemails about discretion and timing. But the episode shifted something essential. It forced authorities who had previously treated Gabriel's case as an isolated criminal investigation to look sideways at a pattern. Prosecutors cannot ignore multi-jurisdictional money trails for long. They are, by design, interested in patterns. The local press that had once accepted the tidy narrative of a philanthropist fell could not unsee a chain that connected shell accounts, consulting memos, and intentional relocations of people described in hush agreements. People who had been paid to look away suddenly had receipts. Derek moved faster than I could keep up with. He followed the money with his steady hunger. He found a wire transfer that had been routed through 3 intermediary accounts and landed for a moment in a corporate account belonging to a holding company registered in a small jurisdiction with no physical office. He traced a consultant contract that had no deliverables beyond risk mitigation and noted the consultee's name matched a shell company on my uncle's ledger. He found metadata that insisted the memo had been created on a date that contradicted the company's story. That metadata, timestamps, IP logs, would become crucial.
It was the kind of thing that doesn't make headlines on its own, but makes a case when you can tie it to human testimony. We began to build a case that did not rely on a single smoking gun, but on a constellation of corroborating pieces. The ledger in my living room, the cassette, the parking garage recording, the shell accounts, a consultant's memo drafted in a firm's internal system, the ledger's pattern of moving vulnerable people out of sight with hush payments. Each piece reinforced the others, and together they formed a portrait that prosecutors could not easily dismiss. The smear campaign responded predictably. Anonymous accounts resurfaced with stories of Gabriel's mismanagement, and worse. Social feeds were saturated with cut-together clips of Gabriel speaking awkwardly in a fundraiser. The smear pieces used an old tactic: take small facts, stretch them, and ask the public to fill the moral space with its worst instincts. They counted on the public to prefer simplicity to nuance. Someone began to post images of Lucia online with insinuating captions, the cruelest, most efficient form of misdirection. The aim was clear: turn the caretakers into suspects and the accused into the sympathetic center. Maya, Derek, and Daniel anticipated this. Maya's episodes included a clear ethics note. They had verified sources, redacted personal details when necessary, and shared the evidence with counsel before publication. Derek used forensic accounting to show payment flows, not conjecture. Daniel filed motions in court to protect witnesses and to seek preservation orders for the most fragile materials. He demanded that the court issue notices to banks tied to the suspicious accounts, compelling them to freeze assets while the investigation proceeded. These were not dramatic acts. They were the unglamorous work that makes justice possible. One night, 2 months after the ledger first surfaced at my engagement, everything turned physical. Derek called me while I was boiling pasta, his voice oddly calm. "They tried to burn it," he said. "They hit the safe house." We drove out to the perimeter where the fire had been. The house still smelled of smoke. There were blackened windows, but the blaze had been rushed and chaotic, sloppy work for someone who wanted neat erasure. The fireman's report later called the cause suspicious. Someone had tried to destroy boxes marked with keywords: Montero, Faria, Consulting. The charred boxes, however, did not tell the whole story. Derek's team had made encrypted copies and stored them elsewhere. Maya had already mirrored a copy of the files to an offshore server. We had backups because we had learned to assume the worst. The arson changed the tenor of our work from defensive to existential. It signaled that the people behind the smear would escalate. It also gave us something else: a moral clarity. You cannot watch someone try to erase the record of human lives and not feel the need to do more.
If they would burn evidence, they would not balk at other intimidations. Derek's investigation began to point toward a central broker, Rick Faria. He showed up in contracts, in consultant memos, in the consultant transfers. He had a network of shell addresses, of corporate rentals, of people whose names surfaced only in footnotes. Derek subpoenaed records. The subpoenas produced a paper trail someone had hoped would never be pulled. Emails showed coordination. The company that had created the mitigation memo had billing entries for consultancy hours on days when the Montero Foundation executives claimed to be at events. A mid-level accountant, pressured by an internal conscience or by fear, handed Derek a burned CD that had been moved from a storage locker. On it were invoices and the names of courier companies used to shuffle money around. Clara's involvement was more nuanced. Her public face had been steel, but in private emails uncovered by Derek and in recordings pulled from an assistant's phone, her voice appeared in strategy sessions. She and Rick talked about limiting exposure and moving assets, and chillingly about making narratives that would be more sympathetic to the family while isolating a particular target, Gabriel. Her hands were on the levers. She did not appear in any way as the mastermind with a smoking gun, but as the person who had the authority to sign things and the influence to direct advisors. She knew enough to shield herself, but she knew enough too to be complicit. As the evidence stacked, the pressures in my family reached a new pitch. There were nights when my cousins would spill beer over their anxieties and ask me why I had to be so public. There were other nights when my uncle sat in my kitchen and told me truths he had never said at the engagement. The ledger was not only his act of conscience, it was his confession of cowardice. He had been the one who had, in quieter years, signed off on late transfers to people who were then relocated. He said he had been afraid of being cut off, afraid of losing status, afraid of the consequences for a family that had always relied on discretion. But the sight of a child left without a defender had undone him. "I kept the ledger because I thought I was protecting you all," he told me. "I found out I'm protecting the wrong things." His voice, when he said it, crumpled in a way that made me understand the inheritance of secrecy. It was not merely financial. It was a culture of making choices by avoiding consequences. Eventually, Daniel made a procedural move that would change the courtroom dynamic.
He filed an emergency motion to preserve all materials tied to the case and to compel the prosecution to name the origin of their financial evidence. If the prosecution's theory rested on records that had been manipulated, the motion argued, then the court needed to know before it could proceed.
Vacating charges is a procedural remedy the court can use. It does not confer innocence, but it prevents a trial predicated on tainted evidence. Daniel framed the motion not as exoneration, but as a request to ensure the process was fair. He argued for forensic accounting by an independent auditor. Judge Ernestine Holloway presided with a blunt clarity that surprised me. She listened as Daniel outlined the forgeries Derek had uncovered, the discrepancies in the accounting, the audio recordings, and a question of who had the motive and the means to manipulate evidence. She allowed Maya's team to submit their materials as public exhibits, while sealing the most sensitive materials for now. She ordered a limited vacature proceeding to determine whether the prosecution's case could proceed without the tainted materials. The courtroom was a place of small theatricalities and big consequences. Cameras lined up. There was an odd hush when Lucia came to testify for the first time in open court. This was not the hospice of a sensational trial. Lucia walked in with a quietness that carried more force than any performative anger. She had always been humble. In court, she became a pillar. Under oath, Lucia described with painstaking detail the day she found Mateo feverish on a white sofa while Gabriel was being led away. She recited the medical timeline, the hospital visit, the note Gabriel had written that day. She explained, in the simplest words possible, why she had refused to hand the boy over to foster services when told that would be the expedient legal route, because he was a child, and no amount of legal convenience justified letting a small person fall through the cracks. Her testimony was not dramatic. It was stead. It landed on jurors and reporters like a small, undeniable truth. When asked about Gabriel's note, Lucia produced a laminated copy. It had a hurried signature, the same name that had been in newspaper bylines and on gala invitations. Daniel used the note to argue the human continuity of care. He did not pretend a handwritten authorization was a court order. He explained in plain language to the court what a guardianship required: a formal petition, evidence of the child's best interests, and a hearing. He asked the court for a temporary guardianship order in Lucia's favor, while the legal questions around Gabriel's detainment were resolved. That request was procedural and limited in scope. It was meant as protection, not a final determination. Judge Holloway, hearing Lucia's testimony and the custody evidence, granted temporary guardianship, citing Mateo's best interest as paramount. The order was careful, temporary, reviewable, and conditioned on ongoing proceedings. The temporary guardianship was a radical change for Lucia. It was not a coronation. It was a recognition that someone's care mattered more than the optics of reputation. The decision made my relatives furious. Some called it an outrage.
Others called it overdue justice. For Lucia, it was a practical lifeline, the ability to enroll Mateo in school, to authorize medical checks, to open a child's future to continuity. Outside the courtroom, the smear machine shifted tactics. They tried to turn Lucia herself into a character of suspicion, an opportunist, they called her, because nothing sows doubt so effectively as accusing your opponent of the crime you themselves committed. A tabloid published a photo alleging Lucia had first class, an image taken out of context that assumed that aid organizations sometimes pay for travel for single parents. The attacks were cowardly. They were also transparent. They aimed to distract. Maya's journalists did not flinch. She published another episode the week after Lucia's testimony, and in it she played the cassette tape that had been on the burned CD. The tape contained a staff meeting in which Clara and Rick discussed reallocating assets, and in a chilling aside referred to moving voices, a phrase that came to mean paying people to leave quietly and never speak. Listeners heard an assistant's voice, tremulous, ask whether they were talking about real people, and they heard the reply: "Collateral is inevitable. We minimize it." That reply landed in a way that was morally corrosive. There is a particular kind of public indignation that arises when the systems meant to make lives better are revealed to treat human beings like line items. The prosecutor's office, under pressure from public scrutiny and the increasingly airtight forensic trail Derek and Daniel had assembled, issued a statement. They had learned of material that raised questions about the reliability of some evidence and were initiating an internal review. The statement was guarded. It was not a retraction. It was not a declaration of innocence.
but it was the kind of water that seeps into gaps and loosens the mortar of a constructed wall. Meanwhile, Derek's work closed in on Rick. He found that Rick had coordinated a logistics company that handled relocations, moves that seemed normal on invoices but had a different content when cross-referenced with personnel files. He discovered small, repeated payments to a pair of consultants who never produced invoices beyond notes that were redacted for legal confidentiality. He matched signatures. He traced a courier route that moved physical documents to a storage locker, one Derek said had been torched the night of the first arson. The criminal net, when it begins to close, is not dramatic for the people who are watching. It is a slow tightening of administrative moves, subpoenas, warrants, ice holds, Interpol red notices. Rick, who had been living abroad for a stretch, found his travel plans complicated by a European bank that froze an account tied to his shell companies after receiving a court order. Investigators coordinated internationally.
Interpol issued a notice, and an extradition request began its bureaucratic climb. Extradition is not immediate. It is a diplomatic and legal process. It involves treaties, holds, and hearings, but it begins with an arrest. The arrest itself was neither theatrical nor swift. Rick was taken in a hotel lobby in a small European city in the middle of the night, quietly, by officers from local authorities who had been in contact with U.S. Marshals. He had been eating room service alone. He looked in the mugshot later published, both unsurprised and furious. He had money and lawyers, and those things buy time. The arrest set off motions, appeals, and legal wrangling about jurisdiction. It was, however, a crucial step. Clara's confrontation was another kind of unraveling. She was called to testify in a civil proceeding related to the finances of the foundation. Under a rules-based deposition, she was asked to explain the consultancy contracts and the company names listed in the ledger. Her public face remained composed, but in private she urged family members to quietly donate funds to PR defenses, to circle the wagons. In a moment of human failure, when she was pressed about a certain email thread, she became flustered and then evasive. It was not dramatic, it was telling. The more the threads were pulled, the less self-assurance she had as an explanation. The climax of our public moment was not a single dam burst, but a week where multiple things converged. A major podcast episode, the filing of motions in court, the extradition of Rick, and a live press conference where Gabriel, released on a procedural vacatur, stood in public for the first time in months. Vacatur, Daniel explained carefully that morning, is a legal order vacating or setting aside previous charges or convictions under certain conditions. It does not equal exoneration. It means the process had irregularities, evidence that could not be trusted, and so the court could not proceed on the case as it had been presented. That procedural move allowed Gabriel to walk out of the holding unit without the stain of an ongoing criminal prosecution hanging like a legal noose. But it did not end the legal story. Other investigations and civil suits continued. It allowed, however, Gabriel to reclaim a measure of agency and to explain himself to the public. Gabriel's press conference was odd in its intimacy. He did not rant. He did not grandstand. He spoke about Matteo in a voice so small it felt like an aside amid the microphones. He thanked Lucia. He said, with more force than I'd heard in months, that he regretted that his presence in philanthropy had been used as a covering mechanism for uglier things. He did not refuse that accountability. He did not say he had been perfect. He instead asked for patience, for the system to work, for investigators to follow the evidence, and for the public to reserve verdicts for courts rather than headlines.
The public loved contradictions, but there was something about a man who had been humiliated and whose child had been tenderly cared for by someone society had labeled invisible that made people pause. On stage with him, Lucia stood like a quiet harbor. Reporters asked her questions she could not be expected to answer, about the ledger, about family loyalty, about the feeling of being attacked. She answered with the cadence she always had, steady, practical, and human. I did not do this to make headlines, she said. I did it because a baby was cold, and no one else would warm him. Maya played the cassette in full at a live town hall event she hosted after the press conference. She walked listeners through what the recordings meant, pressed expert voices into the commentary, and made the case not as a moral sermon, but as a civic matter. When systems value reputation over people, they create incentives for cover-ups. People swore into microphones, voice trembling. A few former employees who had been paid hush money stepped forward. They gave depositions. They said the payments were not voluntary gratitude. They said executives had pressured them to move and accept relocation offers as the only way forward. The town hall became the moment where personal testimony met documentary proof. The public reaction was messy. Some of my relatives stopped talking to me.
There were threshold conversations. Inheritance lawyers and estate planners asked for meetings. Bankers called to reassure. Friends of mine who preferred comfort over conflict dropped away. Yet others called to say I had done the right thing. My uncle, who had started the ledger scandal with a moral shaking, told me he had never been so proud. "You finally made the ledger do what it was meant to do," he said. "You turned shame into accountability." What followed were legal motions and diplomatic maneuvers that cannot be condensed into neat resolution. Rick faced charges in 2 countries, and an extradition request was filed. Extradition involves both the requesting country's legal authorities making a prima facie case and the host country's courts hearing whether the request conforms to treaty requirements. It takes time. It also takes evidence that will stand up to cross-examination. Clara faced civil suits and reputational fallout. Some board members at the Montero Foundation resigned. Funds were frozen pending audits. The foundation's donors demanded transparency. Part of the change, however, came from outside the courtroom, a surge in support for the idea that institutions must have better whistleblower protections. My uncle's ledger became a symbol, not of revenge, but of the argument that families and organizations must have mechanisms to address wrongdoing without simply shoving it under the rug. Lucia's guardianship eventually solidified in a way that respected process.
Daniel filed for a longer-term guardianship petition, presenting the evidence of her caregiving, Gabriel's handwritten authorization, and testimony from hospital staff and childcare workers who had seen her with Mateo. The judge, after a hearing that included social services recommendations and testimony about Lucia's home environment and ability to provide for Mateo, granted guardianship that moved toward permanency. It was not an absolute, immutable decree. It was a legal recognition of what had been true in practice. Lucia was the child's caregiver and deserved the legal authority to act as such. This recognition did not foreclose family involvement in Mateo's life. It required that such involvement be channeled through appropriate legal processes rather than PR maneuvers. After that ruling, there were still fires to fight. The safe house arson was part of an ongoing arson investigation. Investigators traced certain materials back to a contractor who had ties to one of Rick's shell companies. That led to another warrant, another set of interviews, and eventually another arrest. The chain of custody in complex cases like this can be fragile. Evidence gets contested. Witnesses change stories. But each successful legal step mattered more for the system than for any single person. My family splintered in the public eye. Some relatives refused to forgive me. Others called me courageous. We traded letters that were angry and others that were kind. At one point, my mother and I sat in a kitchen and talked like we had never been brave enough to before. I told her I had not done it for revenge. I had done it because a child's life had been on the line. She said, quietly, that she had always feared what our history hid. She confessed that knowing and tolerating made her complicit in ways she was not proud of. That moment, small and private, felt like the slow work of reparation. In the months that followed, Gabriel devoted himself to making the harm right in the ways he could. He did not seek to buy silence. He funded a legal aid clinic for domestic workers and whistleblowers. He set up a small fund to support guardianship attorneys for caregivers like Lucia. He insisted on transparency measures within his foundation. People criticized him for trying to right wrongs with money, but he had seen how money, wielded with accountability, can become a tool to repair some, not all, damage. Rick's extradition process was long and litigious, as such processes are. He litigated to avoid transfer. He filed motions attacking the scope of the requests. He hired high-profile counsel. The net tightened slowly. Ultimately, he was returned to face charges, but the process took time and international negotiation. The news cycle annotated the arrests with caveats. Appeals would be filed, cases would be litigated, but the name Rick Faria was now attached in the public imagination to machinations that had real victims. Clara faced the most human unraveling.
She lost her chair on the foundation board, and her public statements grew fewer and more careful. In one private moment, she called to say she had been naive about the degree of harm some of the solutions she endorsed would cause. She said she had wanted to protect the family. She said, with a voice that sounded like someone who had been surprised by their own moral compromises, that she regretted not asking the right questions sooner. I did not forgive her on the spot. Forgiveness is not a public press release. It is a slow process, if it comes at all. But she had to face, in court and in public, that her power had been used to harm. The epilogue of our public unraveling was not clean. charges were vacated, some investigations continued. Extradition processes moved forward with the slow gears of international law. But the ledger had become a seed of institutional adjustment. The foundation changed its governance. Legal aid was expanded. Policies were implemented to make sure that hush payments could not be made without additional layers of oversight. These changes did not absolve the past. They made the future slightly harder for those who would try the same tricks. For Lucia, the arc was personal and, in a way, redemptive. She did not become a celebrity. She attended hearings, spoke on record when she had to, and kept returning to the small, patient work of raising Matteo. The experience changed her life. She had legal protection, a small salary from the fund Gabrielle helped set up, and the public support of people who had once ignored the kind of labor she performed. At home, in the small apartment she kept, she taught Matteo the names of colors and the cadence of songs she had learned as a child. She taught him to laugh despite the ways the world can be cruel. My life also changed. I lost some relatives and gained a steadier sense of what I was willing to risk for. I had been engaged when the ledger broke open, and the engagement became another casualty of sorts, not because we could not have moved forward, but because the stakes had shifted. My partner and I had to reckon with whether the life we were promising each other would allow the kind of public commitment I had made. We talked for hours about principle and pragmatism, about what it meant to choose a partner who had chosen to be publicly accountable. We did not end on a dramatic fight. We ended with a mutual admission that lives change, and how you handle that change says more about love than vows do. In the months after the public exposure, I found myself drawn to work that turned indignation into infrastructure. I helped set up a small nonprofit, mostly by connecting lawyers like Daniel and journalists like Maya, with local unions and caretaker groups, to create a safe hotline for domestic workers who feared retaliation for speaking up. We established, modestly, a legal fund that could assist caregivers seeking guardianship in emergency circumstances.
It was not a grand foundation in the sense of million-dollar endowments. It was small, gritty, human, much like Lucia's approach to care. The last public hearing in the sequence that defined those months was a procedural one, in which Judge Holloway issued a statement. The court had found enough evidence, fair and untainted process could be pursued. Her order did not declare innocence. It demanded that the criminal justice system meet its own standards. That, in a sentence, is what the law is supposed to do. Not to announce moral verdicts, but to require proof. With the charges vacated, Gabriel was free from the specter of immediate prosecution, but the civil suits and other inquiries continued. That was as it should be. The legal world is not a place for tidy endings. It is a place for process. The final scene I keep with me is not on a stage or in a courtroom. It is in Lucia's small kitchen, months after the worst of the public fury had subsided. Matteo, now walking and stubbornly sticky, was coloring at the kitchen table. Lucia had flour on her hands from a pan she had been making for him. My uncle came by, his hair thinner, his shoulders less square, holding a small box. He had taken to small acts of atonement, quiet donations to local clinics, evening visits to the legal aid office he once feared. He sat opposite us and opened the box to reveal letters he had begun to collect, apologies he had written to people the family had hurt, notes explaining decisions he had made, in a small folder labeled 3 Generations that contained the ledgers, the yellowed letters, and an index of names. He had not expected forgiveness. He did not ask for it. He told Lucia how sorry he was for the ways his silence had protected privilege at the cost of human lives. Then he looked at me, and with a voice that did not tremble, but that carried a new humility, said, "I wanted to keep our house tidy. I thought tidy was safety. I was wrong." I thought of the ledger on my engagement table, and the way I had held it as if the weight of paper could teach me bravery. I thought of Gabriel's note in the hospital, a small, human attempt to make a wrong turn right. I thought of Derek and Maya, hunched over coffee and computers, the kinds of people who do the work no one sees until it becomes impossible to ignore. I thought of the ways families protect themselves, and the price of that protection. My uncle's box did not undo everything. It did not absolve our ancestors. It gave us names to remember, and a paper trail that meant people could be identified, contacted, and where appropriate, held accountable or asked to make reparations.
It gave Lucia an archive that she might one day use to teach Mateo about history, the thing we do not choose but inherit, and the thing we must, sometimes, unmake.
2 years later, at a small ceremony not unlike a community potluck, we opened an office for the Guardianship Fund. Gabriel attended, less in the parade of cameras than in quiet attendance. He spoke about the need to make institutional channels for aid and the dangers of secrecy. Lucia sat at the head of the table, smiling, her hands warm on a bowl of soup. Mateo, older now, picked at a ribbon and occasionally laughed at someone who tickled him. My uncle, whose confession had started the storm, quietly introduced a program in the fund to assist families who had been displaced by hush payments. Because if 3 generations taught us anything, he said, it is that silence can be cumulative damage. The program was small, seed-funded by Gabriel, and supplemented by modest donations from people who wanted to fix a wrong they had once ignored. It was not a cure-all, it was a promise to make channels for help. We named it, not grandly but humbly, the Ledger Project, a nod to the paper that started it all. The idea was simple. If you had been moved with hush money, if your life had been altered by a relocation, the project would help you with legal support, reconnect you with services, and offer small stipends while you found your feet. It was practical restitution, not theatrical apology. At the opening, my uncle stood and told a room of strangers, and I think a family, about why he had stood in that engagement hall. He spoke about how secrecy felt safe until you saw its victims. He spoke about how an entire culture of silence had been allowed to calcify into a defense. He said he wanted to ensure the ledger's names were not only receipts of wrongdoing, but a list of people we owed something to. What I lost in the public fight, I measured against what we had gained. A child who would not be made invisible again. A woman who had been recognized for the care she had always given. A small fund that might prevent another family from making the same mistakes. I did not take victory as a comfortable rap. I took it as a responsibility. There is a line I remember from that summer, when the podcast plays and then fades, and the courtrooms close their doors and the cameras turn away. Truth has a cost. So does silence. You can count the cost in ruined reputations, yes, and in burned evidence. Or you can count it in children who grow up thinking their needs are secondary. I chose, imperfectly and with a fair share of cowardice along the way, to let the ledger be a thing that demanded reckoning. This story is not a movie with tidy closure. Rick's legal battles will go on. Clara will have to live with her choices. Some in my family will never speak to me again. But Mateo is in school. Lucia sleeps without the constant dread of a threat at the door. The Guardianship Fund helps 3 families a month, not because we solved systemic rot, but because we offered a simple thing instead of silence. A lifeline. If you find yourself angry, good. If you find yourself weary, that is understandable. But small, brave acts accumulate. They can, in time, change the architecture of how people protect themselves. They can also teach the next generation to ask different questions. Not, how do we hide, but how do we take responsibility? If this story matters to you, share it with someone who still thinks the cost of comfort is worth more than accountability. It might make them think twice. It might make them start a ledger of their own, but this time with names, not numbers. Names of people they will not allow to be erased. The last sentence I will give this narrative is not heroic. It is quiet and domestic. One evening, months after the fund was started, I sat on Lucia's small balcony while Mateo slept. The city hummed below. She handed me a cup of tea. We watched his small chest rise and fall. Lucia squeezed my hand, the way you squeeze the hand of someone who helped you carry something heavy. "He will be okay," she said. "We will make sure of it." Outside, the lights of the city glowed like ledger lines, some honest, some not. We had a long way to go, but we had, for the first time in a long time, a path to walk.